So in this next section, we're just going to take the lighting a little bit further and start to finalize the lighting in our scene. So we're going to start by adding what's called a fill light, and then also a backlight, which is the light back here, which is a little bit out of my viewport. It's this guy right here. In this process, we're going to just talk a little bit about three-point lighting and how that's set up, how the fill light is not used really to light the scene so much as it is to just light the areas of the scene that are void of information, that are black essentially, because generally you don't want black areas in most scenes. I mean, you can have some black, and there's definitely art forms that use a lot of black, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's always good to at least understand how to create well-lit scenes regardless of what your art style might potentially be. When we're doing the backlight, we're going to go ahead and fill this one with red, as you can see here. So, we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll also talk about far attenuation with this light so that we can kind of control how this light falls off in space. As opposed to just using a real-world algorithm, we're going to kind of cheat that a little bit and use what's called attenuation to create this sort of effect. So to start off with, we're just going to move this light back a bit in the y-axis so that we can see the bottoms of the letters a bit, and then we're going to move it over a little ways, and we might move it up some. And as you can see, as we move it up and further away, things start to get darker. So we're going to have to adjust things a little bit to get them to look right. But we want to use this as what we're going to call the key light. So let's go ahead and name this our key light. And this way we know this is the key light for our scene. Now, again, we've adjusted this a little bit, so let's bring this up just a little bit more, and let's go ahead and make it brighter so we can kind of bring our exposure back up to around where it was. But we're still missing some light back here now as it's fairly dark, and so we'll want to add some more lighting, and this is where we're going to start to talk about what's called the three-point light setup. So the three-point light setup usually consists of a key light, and a fill light, and a backlight. The key light is going to give all of the main objects in the scene the light that it needs. And the fill light is going to fill in most of the areas that the key light does not hit. Generally, you'll be working in a more enclosed area, and you won't necessarily need a fill light in that case, though a lot of people do still use them. Especially if you look at portraiture and things like that, I don't know if you'll see it, but most of those kinds of lighting situations use a fill light to light the side of the face that isn't being directly lit by the key light. That way you never see any dark spots when you're looking at like a glamour shot on the model's face. So to create a fill light, we're simply going to take this key light and just shift copy it over to the right. And we're just going to make this a copy, but we'll go ahead and rename this as we're copying to fill light. Now, since we copied the key light, this is probably a little bit more light than we actually want, and we can also go ahead and reposition this slightly, as we don't need nearly as much light on the tops. However, we could probably also move it back a little ways so that we can start to light the heart a little bit more, but we don't want to lose this corner either, so we move it back out a little bit like this. And so now you're really starting to see that it's filling the areas of the scene that the key light is not hitting. Furthermore, we might want to bring this key light over just a little bit more so that we're getting more of the sides of the eye, for example, maybe back a little bit more. So positioning lights can be tricky, but it's not difficult. It's just moving lights around to kind of spread exposure where we want it. Now, we might take the white color or the yellow color off of this, for example, or we might add different colors, which we might do for the backlight in a moment. And we'll probably want to tone this down a little bit, as we don't want this to be lit more than the key light, which right now this is actually lit more than this area here. So we want to turn this down. Again, the object of this is not to make this bright, it's to simply make it lit. So as long as it's getting lit, then it's doing its job. It doesn't have to be white or bright, as long as it's not dark, right? If we move this over, right, this is dark, right? If we move it back, it's lit, right? But it's not bright. So that's what the fill light is going to do. And I can crank this down pretty low, really, just to give it enough light hitting the sides there. And now, in contrast, we might want to come back to our key light and increase this a little bit, just so that we have a little bit more pop in the elements that are supposed to be lit by the key light. So now that we've got our key light and our fill light, our scene is coming together a little bit. We can always adjust this a little bit and play around with it. You'll want to experiment and come up with different ways to light your scene. You can also, in a lot of cases, turn off shadow maps for your fill light. However, in this case, I've found that for this kind of logo lighting, it can be nice to have the different lights kind of casting different shadows, as it adds a little bit of depth and layered shadows to the scene. But in a lot of cases, you would use a light that would be less harsh. As a sort of extreme example, I've seen photographers that use like a inch thick piece of plexiglass that's frosted to project their light through. Now, what happens when they do this is that the fill light actually winds up using more energy than the key light, but that's because it has to go through an inch thick piece of plexiglass that's frosted. But what that does is it breaks up the light in such a way that it doesn't really cast shadows anymore. There's still some shadow going on, obviously. It's pretty much impossible to eliminate it altogether the way we can in Max, but this kind of mimics that sort of effect. So you want to start to think about real-world light applications and how they can be used in 3D Studio Max. But again, to create the fill light, we simply just copied the key light, and then we just adjusted it. So we just changed the filter color back to white, we lowered the candelas, and we could turn on or off the shadow maps. We could make these harder or softer, if we wanted to. Any number of different things that you could do to kind of separate the two different lights can be helpful, but at the same time, you don't want it to be super apparent that you've got these lights doing exactly what they're doing. You want to leave a little bit of mystery. So next we're going to go ahead and create the backlight. So we're just going to select the fill light, and we're just going to copy that to the back here. And I've lost view of that light, unfortunately. I'll just go ahead and press Alt-W on my screen to bring up the quad menu again, or the quad views again. And I'm just going to orbit around in this other view here, and I'm just going to use this to position it initially. And as long as it's visible in my scene here, I can go ahead and bring this back up and position it using the full viewport here. But we're going to create a backlight. Now, we're going to use this backlight a little bit differently than most people would use backlights. We're going to use it to sort of add some red glow to our scene. So we're going to simply start by selecting the fill color here and going over, making sure we're on red, and we're just going to increase that all the way to red so that we get a nice sort of red glow on our scene. And we can also start to play around with the intensity of this light to make it a little bit brighter. We could bring it higher in the air so that it doesn't leave quite as much of a hot spot but still glows red on the scene. And we can also use something called far attenuation for this light. So what we can do is we can minimize the impact that the red light has on the ground, but still allow it to hit the letters pretty well. So we're going to come over here underneath the dimming subcategory here and turn on far attenuation. And you'll see that this adds another blue circle around our light, which we can now adjust. So we can bring this down like this, and actually it's two circles. The first one is the end, or the light one is the end, and the dark one is the blue. So we want it to start falling off pretty quickly, I guess right around here somewhere maybe. And then we want it to finish falling off down around here somewhere. So now you can see we can control how much of the scene that light is actually hitting. So now we're able to confine that red highlight on the floor into this area here. At the same time, it still falls off to black, so we don't have like a sharp line or anything. But we're also using it to create some nice back highlights on the tops of our remaining two letters back there. Maybe I'll slide this over a little bit more so that it's a little bit more even spread on the heart there. Just play around with the position of this can really make a bit of a difference. And that's basically all we need for our fill light. Now I forgot to rename this as I was copying it, so I'm just going to come up here and call this backlight. And that should be good for the lighting in our scene. Let's go ahead and do a render and see how this looks. Once again, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video as you don't need to see me rendering. So I'm just going to hit Shift Q, and it's going to bring up the rendering, and you can see it start rendering, and I'll just pause. And through the magic of video, bam, it's instant rendering. No, it took 45 seconds to render that, which isn't too bad. But, we've got a nice soft red light on the back here, and we've got our key light lighting this area, but our fill light is also just making sure that we're seeing some information in these darker areas of our rendering. So that's going to be the lighting that we're going to go with for this. So, it's looking pretty nice. Feel free to adjust them, change the colors a little bit, but try to stick within this basic color palette and try to not necessarily copy exactly what I've created here, but get it fairly close. Okay, so that wraps up lighting for this project, and once again, to finalize the lighting, we simply created a fill light and a backlight, which is the light back here that's casting that red glow on the top of our eye and onto our heart there. Remember, with 3-point lighting, the goal is not always to light the scene. It's really just to fill in the darker areas of the scene, especially with things like fill lights. Backlights can be used to add effect or to just light the backs of objects so that when other things reflect the backs of those objects, there's some information there. They can also be used as what's called a rim light, which can be used to create a halo around an object, but that doesn't really apply to this scene, as it would be pretty hard to get a light down far enough to create a halo for these objects. But there's lots of different reasons to use these kinds of light systems. The 3-point light system is not necessarily a specific thing. It's more of a experimental kind of science that you play around with to create nice effects with the lighting in your scene, and really bring depth and perspective to your scene.